We're going to continue looking at themes of change at the turn of the 20th century, all related to a period of economic growth and expansion. I already explained in a previous video about industrialization. We're going to look at immigration, and then today I'm going to explain the West. All of these are interconnected themes. The West providing, of course, resources, new markets for industrialization, immigration and immigrants providing a labor force for industrialization, immigrants also looking for new opportunities in the West. So this entire period associated with a great period of change, growth, and expansion. In terms of location, the West is defined as a great, vast region between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean, largely including the area known as the Great Plains, vast area of grassland, flat territory. The Great Plains had not really been settled by Americans up until the turn of the 20th century, but by the turn of the 20th century this territory will be filled up with American citizens and recent immigrants, and of course as the territories are filled up they qualify to become states. So by the turn of the 20th century, all the states that make up the continental U.S. have been admitted into the Union. These are some of those states, including Oklahoma, which used to be Indian Territory, is now a U.S. state, recognized in 1907. A lot of the westward movement is enabled by the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad is built by two private companies, including the Central Pacific, which built from the west, east, and the Union Pacific Railroad Company, which built from east to west. And then, of course, they'll meet at the famous Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, and this is that famous toast, the meeting of the two railheads that was celebrated. Now, this building of the railroad was largely enabled by the federal government in the form of special considerations to these railway companies in land, grants, and money. This is showing per mile of track the amount of land that was given to the railway companies. So unlike when we talked about industrialization and a laissez-faire, hands-off regulatory system, the government is very much hands-on in providing land grants and incentives, these special considerations to building the railroad for internal improvements. The other thing to recognize that we talked about before is the role of immigrant labor, largely the Chinese, in building the western portion of the railroad. Very dangerous work that was completed by these immigrants. This is also the period of the American cowboy. Their job was to go down south to South Texas, sometimes raiding the border into Mexico, and rounding up these long Texas Longhorns, which were basically a wild breed of cattle that had intermixed over the generations from Spanish and English cattle from the colonial days. So there's thousands of cattle to be had, and they start running them north, herding them north. Of course, the cattle are eating along the way. This drive north is called the Long Drive. The Long Drive will take them eventually to these cow towns like Ogallala and Abilene and Ellsworth, and these are cow towns, but they're also railheads, and so the cattle will be loaded onto these railroads and then shipped to places like Chicago, which we learned was a meat packing center. This will be all open prairie, unfenced, open land, up until Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire. That would be a form of fencing, of course, that will end the open range, and there was a period known as the barbed wire wars between sheep men and cattle men that gets a little complicated, but namely associate the cowboy with this economic, cattle industry and its links to Chicago that we looked at before. In terms of people moving west, a lot of Southerners, particularly a lot of African Americans, will move west after the Civil War seeking new opportunities. We learned a lot about the violence in the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction era, and so a lot of people just wanted to get out and seek better opportunities in a new region of the country. Famous to this movement would be the Exodusters. This is showing a picture of former slaves, multi-generational family that was led by Benjamin Pap Singleton out to Kansas. They're shown quite proudly sitting in front of their new home in Kansas, this sod house. Many African Americans served as cowboys, soldiers, Buffalo Soldiers for the federal government. So keep that in mind. That particular population was very interested in the new opportunities in the West. Many Americans were given a huge incentive by the federal government, again, to move west from the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and it gave free land to those who would move out west, live on the land, farm the land. If you were successful after 5 years, the land was yours. So if you could get yourself there, if you could make it through all the challenges of living in the West, it was an opportunity to be a landowner. I showed you some of the early starter homes. This is a soddy. The homes made on the treeless prairie, actually from the sod of the prairie itself, so there's actually grass from the prairie still growing on your house. We laughed and said eventually your dream would be to maybe order a house from Sears, and they'd pack up all the lumber and tools and ship your house out to the prairie if you were successful in going to stay. These are some other pictures of soddies in the West. The brick, of course, for the sod from the earth. Very tough work. A lot of the success of living on the prairie is about being able to efficiently harvest a crop, and up until Cyrus McCormick developed a quick mechanized way of harvesting wheat, you had to harvest wheat by hand. So it kind of limited how much wheat you could actually grow because you couldn't harvest very much by hand. So in addition to the railroads, the mechanical reaper developed by Cyrus McCormick, these are both pictures of that instrument, provided a quick, efficient way to essentially grow more wheat and have more land in production in the West. So that's important to remember. As a general theme, by the turn of the 20th century, the plains, the Rockies, are no longer frontiers. The frontier is closed. Now we have farms, ranches, towns that are cropping up in that area between the Mississippi and the Pacific Ocean. Of course, this doesn't come without a cost to the Native American people. There are nearly 500,000 Native peoples who were living on the Great Plains, relying on the buffalo as their way of life. Once people start moving into this area, people like Frank Mayer, who's a buffalo hunter, they exploit the resources of the West, killing the buffalo for profit. This is showing some of the buffalo hides, and it, of course, destroys the Native American culture and way of life. This is a famous picture of a bunch of buffalo bones and somebody standing on the top of that pile. As people started to move out west, the government tried to come up with a solution for how to deal with the Native American population. And one of the more famous ways of dealing with the Native American population was placing them on reservations. By definition, reservations is land that the government set aside and told natives to live on. Of course, this was not received very well. Oftentimes, once put on reservations, they were dependent on the government for food and clothing, and that didn't always pan out so well. And so there was often violent conflict associated with the reservation system. This is an area highlighted to note one of the reservations where the Sioux were told to live by the federal government. At one point, George Custer was sent out west in 1876 to basically round up some of the Sioux that were not abiding by the rules. We had also discovered gold in the Black Hills area, and so settlers were moving in and they were coming in conflict with the native people, and so George Custer was out there to deal with the natives who were in the way of white progress, so to speak. And at that point, he underestimated how much force he needed, and the Sioux, with their leader Sitting Bull, who you see here, will ambush Custer and his men and kill all of them in resistance to that government crackdown. And this is famously known as Custer's Last Stand and represents one of the more famous acts of violence in the West, largely associated with the reservation system. Over time, you can see here, as punishment and just as sort of Americans move into the territory, the reservation land gets smaller and smaller. This is another illustration of the loss of ancestral land. We had talked about from the time of Jackson in the early 1800s that Oklahoma, by product of the Trail of Tears, had become the Indian Territory. But by the late 1800s, the post-Civil War era, people are moving in, and so the government opens up this territory too to settlement. You can see that they actually had a land race for settlers who were interested in living in Oklahoma, all the while, of course, natives just watching their land be taken by Americans. The ghost dance was a way that the native people of the prairie tried to resist. This was kind of a spiritual movement where you would wear a ghost shirt representing your ancestors. They would become somewhat in a trance-like state, evoking the power of their ancestors, and they came to believe that this would be almost like a bulletproof vest. So the government feared that this would encourage militant acts of resistance, and they basically told the natives that this was illegal. They started rounding up people like Sitting Bull, who was behind the ghost dance practices, and one of the outcomes to crack down on the ghost dance, we find the incident known as Wounded Knee, where apparently federal officers shot men, women, and children who were trying to escape the reservation. And so this becomes another tragic event of Native American conflict. I talked about in class the sole survivor, miraculously, of this slaughter was a little baby who becomes known as the Lost Bird. So her story is quite famous as part of the tragedy of the West. Other people like Richard Pratt tried to find more peaceful solutions to the Native American issue in the West, and his plan was to open schools. This one, his Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, was to assimilate or bring Native Americans into mainstream white society so they could kind of blend in and not be slaughtered by American westward movement. And he tried to show the success of this by posting before shots, of poor Indians off the reservation, and then how they've become kind of Americanized. Their hair cut, dressed in suits, looking much more improved. This was all to prove the success of his program of assimilation. These are showing, again, native dress versus Americanized assimilation style weddings. Children saying the pledge, learning American history, learning math, all the main ideas of becoming American citizens are shown in these pictures. Even religion, trying to teach them Christianity and take the native kind of ideas out of their head of religion and spirits and nature and those sorts of things from the plains. Teaching women how to cook, how to work on a stove as opposed to outside on an open hearth, how to sew, men how to farm. Eventually we also see the Dawes Act encouraging Native American families to settle down and encouraging them to farm, sort of reducing the amount of land that they needed like they had in their traditional ways with the buffalo hunt, and trying to encourage them to take up less space, essentially, to allow more Americans to move in on the prairie without the conflict that we had seen with the reservation system. Of course, this was not perfect. Over time, this is a sad story for Native Americans. From 1850 to 1990, this is showing the dwindling land that was available to Native American people. So for the West and the Native American story, it's a story of loss and violence and tragedy, more than one of progress. Please review the slides, the story, understanding how it's connected to the other themes of change at the turn of the 20th century.